Okay, our next two speakers are going to be on stage together. Kimberly Hartke is the publicist of the Weston A. Price Foundation, a leading nutrition education nonprofit which promotes sustainable agriculture, traditional food. She also hosts the blog HartkeIsOnline.com. Dawn Griffith-Molina is the mother of 6 children and a practicing nutritional therapy practitioner in Herndon, Virginia. As a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation and the founder of Sunrise Nutritional Therapy, she helps clients enhance their health, boost their energy, maintain a healthy weight by focusing on consuming both traditional and living foods. Today, both ladies are going to be talking about fermenting your way to radical health. Please help me welcome Kimberly and Dawn.
You know, I met with Robin when this conference was just a gleam in her eye, and it's so exciting to see her grow this, persevere, start the International Health Coaches Association. You know, when I was a kid, there was no such thing as a health coach. And I think it speaks to the state of our economy, our society, our health, that we have health coaches. We need people to come alongside and help us with this. So, you know, when we look at the children in our country, this is the sort of the barometer of what's going on health-wise. Do you realize that in the last 20 years, childhood allergies have increased over 500%, and the doctors don't know why? And in the last 30 years, the number of obese children has doubled. The worst statistic of all is the autism rate has just skyrocketed. It's gone up 1,148%. I mean, autism was unheard of in this country, you know, when I was a kid. And now there's seeing that upwards of maybe 1 in every 48 boys is autistic. So we need to get a grip on health, and the whole concept of taking back our health and taking it into our own hands is what motivated my husband and I a few years ago to start our own health journey. We both had health issues. I had chondromalacia patella, or runner's knee. My husband was pre-diabetic and he had high blood pressure. And because of lifestyle changes, getting in the gym, changing our diet, starting to source our food locally, buying grass-fed meats, wild-caught salmon, etc., we lost 50 pounds between us, and we've conquered pretty much our health issues. I mean, I still to this day do a no nightshade diet, like a nightshade elimination diet for my knee pain. But I went from almost crippling knee pain to having a normal life again. So it can be done. I'm just living proof of that. I'd like Dawn to introduce herself and what her role is here today, and then we'll go on with the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Is my mic on? Yes. Yeah, my name is Dawn Griffith-Molina, and I am a nutritional therapy practitioner, and we subscribe almost 100% to the Weston A. Price lifestyle. And I live right here in Herndon, so anyone that's local, if you are in need of a nutritional therapist or you know someone, please keep me in mind. I have business cards in the back, and I also prepare fermented foods for clients, family, friends, and anyone else who's interested. Today, at my table, we will be there until 5 o'clock today, so please come by, and if you want to learn anything more about fermentation that wasn't covered here, I can talk to you, or you can go to the Weston A. Price table and Kimberly can talk to you. So without further ado.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to be talking about fermented foods, and they're powerful, they're probiotic, and they're preserved. Fermented foods is actually an ancient preservation method that preceded canning, because back in the day, they didn't have jars with lids that screwed on, and they didn't have canning equipment. They literally had to let nature take its course. So what you see here is a group of fermented vegetables of different sorts, and you'll notice one bottle of yellow liquid. Dawn, would you hold up your bottle of whey? This is a byproduct of making yogurt. It's full of lactobacillus organisms. These are little microbes that actually do the preserving, and they stimulate the growth of nutrients. They actually increase the vitamin levels in the fermented foods, and they also enhance digestibility for these foods. For instance, cabbage is very, very tough to digest, and fermented cabbage is a lot easier to digest, and it's very good that way. Oh, that jumped without me touching it. Anyway, the other thing about fermented foods, before we go on to the next slide, I wanted to tell you is that lactobacillus organisms are present on the surface of all living things, especially those things that grow close to the ground. So when we're dealing with lactofermentation, we want the freshest foods. I once went to a farmer's market and told her I was going to make some sauerkraut. She got in her little golf cart and went to the field to pick it. She goes, "You need the freshest cabbage to do this with," because lactobacillus require a high amount of vitamins and minerals to do their work. So we recommend not necessarily getting these vegetables from the grocery store, but seeking out local sources, particularly biodynamic or organic sources. And the lactofermentation process actually produces an antibiotic type substance in the food and an anti-carcinogenic type substance in the food, and it also increases enzyme content for those of you that are interested in enzymes. And I call this, for those raw foodists in the audience, this is medicinal raw food or therapeutic grade raw food, because these are foods that actually can heal. They can bring a digestive tract back into health. They can build immunity. They can do so much for the human body because we're, once again, cooperating with nature. This is a study of children that attended a Waldorf school. It was published in The Lancet, which is a very prestigious British medical journal. In any event, they found in these children that the consumption of lacto-fermented vegetables was positively associated with low rates of asthma, skin problems, and autoimmune disorders compared to the children that weren't eating the lacto-ferments. Sauerkraut, I mentioned earlier, is the most popular vegetable ferment in the world. Many cultures have their own version of sauerkraut, and today we're going to show you a German recipe. But sauerkraut is an interesting food. It's an example of how the lactobacillus increase vitamin content, because the vitamin C content in sauerkraut is much, much higher than the vitamin C in cabbage alone. And it's the work of those microorganisms that make that happen. It's also very high in a nutrient that's very deficient in the American diet called choline. Choline is found in egg yolks, and because our government guidelines have for years discouraged people away from eating eggs, which are nature's perfect food, to eating breakfast cereals and Pop-Tarts, we have a nationwide deficiency in this nutrient. So you'll find it in sauerkraut. Choline lowers blood pressure, it regulates the passage of nutrition into your blood, and it also aids the body in the metabolism of fats. So if you enjoy fatty meats like sausage and hot dogs and things like that, that's why sauerkraut was traditionally served with those foods, because our forebears learned that those meals went down better with a load of sauerkraut on the side. So Dawn's going to take it from here and show you the recipe, if I can get it to go to the next slide.
In order to make sauerkraut, you just need a few things. You need a head of cabbage, preferably your own grown, organic, non-preservative sauerkraut. And then you need some caraway seeds, and this is optional. This is the recipe in the Nourishing Traditions book that I use by Sally Fallon. And you also need a little bit of whey. Since whey is a milk byproduct, people that don't eat dairy or are sensitive to dairy could just add a little more salt. And I do have recipes in the back for those of you who need this recipe, or you can purchase our book that we're selling at the Weston A. Price table and my table for $25. The only other thing you need is sea salt. So I'm going to experiment and show you what I do. The first thing I do, let me cut up this cabbage. You can use a knife, you can use a V-slicer, or you can use a food processor. I usually just cut mine by hand, and I just cut it in 4 sections and core it as such. I'll show you that. Okay, and then I will just toss the core away. I actually did pre-cut some cabbage earlier, so this is what I'm going to show you. I'm actually going to be doing this. So the recipe says a medium head of cabbage, and then we have 4 teaspoons of whey. And you see it's like a liquid, very watery substance. I'm putting 4 tablespoons in there. And then it calls for 1 teaspoon of sea salt. And then 1 teaspoon of caraway seeds. Okay, so next thing you do is just mix it all around. And then we're going to be using what I call, this is a kraut pounder. And there are a couple different versions of this. The one that I got is available in the Wise Traditions quarterly magazine. When you become a member of Weston A. Price, you will get a quarterly magazine, and we advertise for all types of things for fermentation and other healthy ways of eating. This was about $25, maybe $29, and then you just pound. You pound for about 10 minutes. And what the pounding does, and I'm not going to pound here for you, but I'm just trying to show you exactly what you would do. It releases the natural juices in the cabbage, and you need those natural juices to speed up the fermentation process. So after about 10 minutes, you will notice that the bottom of the bowl will have liquid in it. And so after you pound and pound and pound, the way that I do it is I just have my pint-sized cup, and after it's all liquefied, I push the cabbage in. Okay. I fill it to the top, and then you squeeze the cabbage down with the other side of the kraut pounder. Now, this is not liquefied just in essence of time, since we have a lot to cover today. So after you push it in, you push down as hard as you can, and in normal circumstances, you will see liquid rise to the top, and you want to get at least a ½ inch of liquid to the top as you're pushing down. Okay, and once all the cabbage is covered, then you know it's ready to be fermented. You just put a lid on it. You can leave it in a room temperature. It doesn't matter what the light is, although it will ferment a little bit quicker if it's in a darker place, so you can put it in a cabinet or right on your counter. Leave it there for 3 to 7 days. The longer you leave it there, the more vinegary it will taste, so you have to really adjust it based on your own preferences. So my cabbage, my sauerkraut, I ferment for 4 days, and you can kind of see the difference. This is what it looks like. And we have samples for everyone. Elise, my 13-year-old daughter is going to be giving out about 10 samples of sauerkraut. And let's see, that's about it. Okay. So if you want sauerkraut, just raise your hand. We don't have samples for everyone, but we will have samples of other things as well as we go on.
Keith Steinkraus is a Cornell University scientist. He wrote the book, The Indigenous Handbook of Fermented Foods. This is what he has to say about lactic acid fermentation. It renders foods resistant to spoilage. It renders them less likely to carry pathogens. It preserves the food. It modifies the flavor, and it improves the nutrition. One of my favorite recipes is fermented salsa. It's a wonderful thing to go to the Midsummer's Farmer's Market, get your peppers, garlic, cilantro, tomatoes, onion, and just a clean cutting board and a nice chef's knife, chop, 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 and you have this wonderful celebration of zest. Now, this does not keep as long in the refrigerator as the sauerkraut. I found after about 4 months, it was a little frizzly on the tongue, and I didn't prefer that. I think that even in the refrigerator, the microbes were still having a field day. So what I did at that point is I poured it into one of those clay bakers with a clay cover, and I roasted a chicken in the sauerkraut that had kind of like over fermented, and it was absolutely delicious. So the thing about it is heat will take care of stopping cold any microbial activity. So you can still cook with a ferment if you don't want to eat it raw anymore. Let's just go through a little bit of a comparison, because what we're talking about is a different way of preserving food than canning, and most conventional foods are canned foods. They're manufactured in large factories, etc. They pickle with vinegar, which is acetic acid, and we are using lactic acid, which is culturing with salt and the natural microbes in the food. They sterilize with pasteurization, whereas we're protecting the food with probiotic life forms. They irradiate the food to make it safe, whereas we're working in symbiosis with nature. We're keeping the food alive. They start with food grown in dead soil, and then they sterilize it so it's totally without life. Whereas we're supporting farmers who use living soil. If you've gotten any exposure to your local farm movement, you'll notice that the farmers that are really popular are tending their soil as though they were a creature on their farm. They're feeding their soil. They're encouraging microbial life to grow in the soil. And that's how the lactobacillus ends up all over the plants and the food. So it's interesting how my presentation keeps going on. Hold on a second. They're supporting agri-industrial giants, whereas we're seeking, once again, to use the high-quality ingredients. Industrial foods may have GMO ingredients. That stands for genetically modified organisms, which, if you know anything about the labeling issue, people want their GMOs labeled because they're known to be cancer-causing and toxic. And people have a right to know that that's in their food. But right now, we don't have that universal right to know. So one way Weston Price members are getting around that is we're opting out of the conventional food supply and going directly to our local source. And we get to know our local farmer, and we ask him questions about the use of GMOs on his farm, or lack thereof. And we tend to stick with the farmers that we know have a strong policy against using GMO feed or GMO fertilizers or seeds or anything. Anyway, the conventional system is producing mass food for the masses, but it's dead, sterile food. It does have a long life. However, canning can be way more dangerous than lactofermentation, because if botulism, if a pathogen does get into a sterilized can of food, it can go rampant because there's no competing probiotic microorganisms to keep them from becoming a death knell. So people have died of canning and they have died of botulism, but they haven't died of lactofermentation. Anyway, the one difference is that our products do need to be refrigerated after their initial fermentation process at room temperature, and that slows the microbial growth and it keeps the lactobacillus in check and keeps them from eventually spoiling the food by going too far. Pickled cucumbers is another popular recipe in the Nourishing Traditions cookbook. And by the way, these foods have been repopularized in this modern age, largely as a result of Sally Fallon's work. She wrote this cookbook in she started the Weston Price Foundation in 1996, so she probably wrote the cookbook a number of years before that. But the cookbook has sold over 250,000 copies. And you'll meet chefs that are using this in their restaurants. You'll meet a lot of local cooking teachers that are cooking classes about this cookbook. The pickled cucumbers just call for filtered water, dill, mustard seed, and salt. And you could add the whey as an inoculant or the extra salt if you're avoiding dairy. The widest variety of foods ever can be fermented. In fact, every major food group, we're talking protein, we're talking fruits and vegetables, we're talking dairy. Every food group has fermented foods, and we're just not aware of that because we've been living too long in this modern age where it's not done on a wide scale. So these foods are artisanal, the ones that are coming back into vogue now. But here's some examples. You can ferment chutneys, you can ferment ketchup and mustard. These are all recipes in Sally's cookbook. You can culture a fruit sauce or jams. Things like applesauce can be cultured. Fermented bean paste is probably an ethnic food. I've never had it. Have you, Dawn?
No, I haven't.
No? Sourdough breads are fermented. Basically, true sourdough is where you take the wild yeast from the air and you let it ferment the dough over a period of like 7 days. It's not the instant yeast bread we're familiar with, but true sourdough is a long time process, and it's more of a fermented process. We make fermented waffles, fermented pancakes using Sally Fallon's recipe, and I'll go into that a little bit more when I talk about dairy, because that's a dairy ferment. This is my husband fermenting. Actually, I make the fermented pancake batter, and then he helps me make the pancakes. And we actually dehydrate these pancakes that we have left over and make crackers out of them. But my husband is absolutely wild about Sally Fallon's cookbook. He thinks I'm the best cook ever since I started cooking her recipes. And he literally stands over my shoulder when I'm cooking, trying to learn the recipes. And he explains, it's in case you die. I want to know how to do this myself. I want to know how to take care of myself. So I wrote on this one guy's blog this thing about my husband's having a love affair with a cookbook author, and it's Sally Fallon. So these are some examples of ethnic cultured foods. So when you're in an ethnic restaurant, I want you to be on the lookout for this. Miso, tempeh, and tofu are Japanese ferments. These are examples of soy ferments. The Japanese ancient culture, they fermented soy for over a year to make it safe for human consumption. And the Weston Price Foundation has a soy alert campaign to warn people about modern soy foods. They're really, literally not safe for human consumption because they haven't dealt with the anti-nutrients, they haven't dealt with the estrogen, the phytoestrogens in them, and this kind of thing. So these, if you get traditional fermented soy, we do consider that a safe food. But soy milk and things like that, I would avoid. Indian idli is a fermented lentil and rice dish, comes from India. Ethiopian injera bread, how many of you have had that? It's so good. It's real spongy and kind of moist. It's almost like a pancake, but it's real moist and spongy. That's a fermented grain called teff. It's a grain that's an ancient grain that's only grown in Ethiopia. But there are local restaurants that serve it, and it is wonderful. Middle Eastern falafel, can anybody tell me what that is fermented? Chickpeas, yes. I've had that all my life. I'm a former vegetarian, and I lived on the stuff, and I had no idea that it was a fermented food. And maybe some of the modern boxed mixed falafels aren't fermented, who knows? But the original, ancient recipe was a ferment. In the Latin cultures, they actually soak corn in pickling lime for a week. And this is a way of releasing the niacin and the other nutrients. It's called masa. So I actually saw corn chips in the store recently made with masa instead of just regular corn. And that's what you want to look for because I wrote an article on my blog about the violence and the school shootings and everything. And there is something, a niacin deficiency causes a form of madness. And they saw this in the early days of America where people lived in poor regions and they were living off of a lot of corn, but they weren't fermenting the corn. They were very glum and moody and agitated, and they tend to feel like the world's against them. They developed a form of paranoia. So it's very important that you look for corn masa when you're making cornbread, for instance, instead of just regular corn flour, cornmeal. And these are some of the sauerkraut ferments from around the world. Latin cortito has a number of additional things to it. It has spicy ingredients and onions. Korean kimchi is the same. It's a spicier form of the sauerkraut. And then Japanese tsukimono. I've never had that. Has anybody ever had that in a restaurant? I've never had it, so I can't tell you much about it. This is from a French book. Who here speaks French and can tell us what the name of her book translates to in English? Does anybody speak French?
The raw all year long?
The raw all year long. Thank you. Anyway, Annalise Schank says, the state of our intestinal flora contributes not only to the absorption of nutrients and the functioning of the intestines, but also to our ability to release infections or resist infections. And actually, I read the book by Dr. Campbell McBride. It's the book about the GAPS diet, and I'm forgetting the name offhand.
Put Your Heart in Your Mouth, or?
No, the other one.
She has 3 books in total.
Oh, shoot. In any event, she talks in there, she quotes a French guy that was like the father of modern psychiatry, and he says, all disease begins in the gut. So the French know this full well, but we don't know this. Our modern shrinks over here in America aren't telling people, go do something good for your gut health. That's your job, right? We have to get the health coaches involved. But Annalise, for her book, she interviewed a doctor, and he said he'd never seen a cancer patient with healthy gut flora. And Annalise says in her book that people that are sick have weak digestion and they lack digestive juices, not just during the acute phase of their illness, but for a long time afterwards. And so this is why fermented foods are very, very helpful for the cancer patient. They have vitamins, they have minerals, they have enzymes that cancer patients are lacking, and that's probably one reason they got sick. So a particular benefit, though, she talks about is lacto-fermented beets. There's been a lot of scientific beet research that says that beets are have a very regenerating effect on the human body. And the lacto-fermentation of the beets, for some reason, it helps with disturbed cellular function. So when my father was fighting cancer, a Weston Price chef, one of the first things she told me is that kvass is a blood tonic, and your father needs to drink this to cleanse his blood. So anyway, would you like to demonstrate how to make beet kvass?
Sure. Just wanted to say something else about beet kvass. Beet kvass is wonderful if you have gallbladder issues or if you have sluggish bile, because it thins the bile and it helps emulsify fats. So I know most of you out here are health coaches. If you have anyone that does not have a gallbladder anymore, they definitely need some support. And it could be supplements, but the best way, as we know, is food. So please encourage beets. What I do to make my beet kvass is I have already peeled my organic beets, and I cut them up, and I just fill this jar. This is a quart-sized mason jar, about 1/3. Okay, so you will need beets and the mason jar. They are not. These are raw. All these fermented vegetables are raw vegetables. Yes, all the recipes that we're showing today are all from Nourishing Traditions.
And it's in the tonic section.
Right.
It's not in the beverages section, which is where I thought it would be, but it's in the tonics because it's considered so medicinal.
Right, so this is about 2 medium-sized beets, and as I said before, we have recipes in the back, and then I add a 1/4 cup of whey. So I'll just demonstrate how to do this. This is a 1/4 cup of whey. And then I add a tablespoon of sea salt.
Where'd your salt go?
Okay. And again, if you have a milk allergy, you could use a little bit of salt. That will make it a little more salty. And then this is my filtered water from home. Just fill it up. And there you have it. So, just like the sauerkraut, I shake it up a little bit. Just like the sauerkraut, you let it sit for about 4 days on the counter. And after about 4 days, this is what it looks like, okay, versus that day. And you can see the color changing as the days go on. And Elise will, she has about 10 samples. Anyone who wants to try the beet kvass, just raise your hand. We don't have enough for everyone, but she'll just get to whoever she can. And we also have samples at the table inside the lecture hall as well. Okay. That's a very good question. So you add about a 1/4 more salt. So if that was a tablespoon, I would add another 1/4 tablespoon of salt. Okay, and that's also in the book. She's very specific and clear exactly how much salt you should use if you don't want to do whey. Any other questions about this?
Yes. How long after it's fermented, 4 days or so, how long will it keep? And are we keeping it in the fridge?
Good idea. Okay, very good. Well, both with the sauerkraut and with the beets, you can ferment between 3 and some people go as long as 14 days. And the more it ferments, the more vinegary it is. So you really have to do it by taste. I like the 4 to 5 day period. And then after that, after you are finished, you put it in the fridge just to stop the fermentation process. And the beet kvass, I will keep this for about 6 months in the fridge. Sauerkraut, I'll keep up to 9 months in the refrigerator. It really does last long. And fermented foods also were used before the refrigeration process was even around. This is what people used to do, our ancestors, before the modern age. Yes?
Before you put it in the refrigerator, do you have to strain the beets, or you could leave the beets in the kvass when you put it in the refrigerator?
I leave them in the beets. I leave the beets in. It's really up to you. A lot of people like to strain the beets out and eat them. Some people strain half the beets out and eat half of the beets. It's really personal preference. One thing that I did not mention is that you want to leave a little bit of room. This is about a 1/2 inch. You don't want to fill it way to the top because it will expand a little bit over time. And the longer you ferment it, the more it will expand. So we're going to leave a little bit of room on the top. And that's for all the ferments. Yes?
The water that you use, do you need to remove and filter out both the fluoride and the chlorine?
Well, that's a water conversation, which we are not really going to get into now. That's
For
Well,
that fluoride will harm the bacteria.
it works better without fluoride or chlorine, but I've seen people ferment with chlorine in the water. Yeah, so, yeah, that's a water conversation, yes? I think so.
I would think it would be
They're
great.
a little soggy, but I think you can juice them.
They would probably
That's a
juice
great idea.
easier. And by the way, I had a fermenting accident this week. I put a ton of beets down my garbage disposal. I had to have my pipes snaked twice because it clogged. So don't ever, just throw them in the trash if you're not going to eat them. But you can slice them and put them on a salad. What I do is I do strain them out and I add more filtered water, put it back in I use my corner cupboard to ferment. I put it back in the corner cupboard for 2 or 3 more days and I get a second batch out of the same beets. And then I consider them fairly well spent because they've been leached from twice, you know. So I do just throw them out. But if you wanted to not make the beet kvass but eat the beets or juice the beets, I would do it because they're going to be full of probiotics. Wonderful. Another thing, why don't we show them how to make whey now so that they can actually see before the end of the talk.
Okay. Sure.
Sure.
I've tried making beet kvass, and I don't like the flavor at all, although I love beets. Is there some way that you would recommend to sweeten it? Have you tried using apples or something like that?
You can definitely do a second ferment is what we call it. So you would ferment it the way that I showed you, and then you can actually, after the 4 or 5 days or however many days you want to put it in the refrigerator, you can cut up apples, strawberries, you can cut up almost any fruit and put it in the refrigerator again and wait about 24 hours. So it's not really a second ferment, but the flavor from the fruit definitely gets infused inside the kvass. And it will take away
It's
a
a
little
great
bit of
idea.
that saltiness.
It's a new one for me too.
Thank you. And one more question for you. Are you burping your jars?
I don't.
Well, I did want to warn people about that. The person that was making it for my dad said if he goes too long at room temperature, have him be very careful when he opens the jar because I've had it explode all over the ceiling of my kitchen. And beets are, you know, they stain. You'd have to repaint your kitchen ceiling. So it is good to gently check and see if there's a lot of gas in there because the lactobacillus, they're living organisms. They produce gas. That's why you leave some headroom in each jar.
Yeah,
But-
typically after just 4 days, you don't really need to burp, but it won't hurt at all if you burp. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Kimberly's homemade yogurt, and what we're doing, we're actually making whey. What I have here is a cheesecloth, or what's another word for this?
Cheesecloth?
I guess it is. Nut bag, could be a nut milk bag
Yeah,
or a
the
cheesecloth.
New Family Naturals is selling a nut bag outside that could be used for this, and my yogurt maker came with a cheese bag. See the big one? So I use that as well. The cheesecloth is kind of pricey, so your cheese bag, you just rinse it with clear water, hang it up to dry, and you can use it again and again. Whereas the cheesecloth, you have to throw it away after each use, so it gets pricey. I recommend getting a bag.
Right, so this is actually this is what they sell outside. This is just a strainer, and I just put 2 layers of this on.
And we recommend that you use glass and silicone. Do not use metal because these microorganisms are reactive to metal. You just don't want to use stainless steel or aluminum. Just always use the silicone and glass. So what will happen is the whey will drip out, and
It takes a few minutes.
then the whey keeps like almost forever in the refrigerator. I put it in the coldest part of my refrigerator. It'll last months and months.
Yeah, and this is what it will turn out to be, but it does take a little while. So in the essence of time, we're not going to watch this whole thing. But I've kept mine for as long as 3 months, and it's been fine. Yes, you have a question?
Wants to get the raw yogurt, raw milk yogurt?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
But we recommend, the brand of yogurt that I had my own homemade yogurt packaged in is 7 Stars Yogurt. It is a brand that's, did you empty the whole thing in there?
No, I didn't. I just
Okay,
did half
he
of it.
said, do you have to use raw milk yogurt? That was the question. He said, do you have to use raw milk yogurt? I'm sorry. I'll try to repeat every question from now on because I'm not good at that. And the answer is you want to use a good quality, plain grass-fed yogurt, and they do have those at Whole Foods.
Full fat.
Full fat. You don't want to use low-fat yogurt.
And if you,
Right. It's not necessary because
well, I buy my whey currently from my farmer, so there are farmers that will sell raw milk.
And at the end of the talk, I'm going
Right.
to give you some resources where you can actually buy these ferments in a package form. They would be powdered lactobacillus. You can also, if you want, use a lactobacillus capsule. Just open a capsule instead of using whey. So there are alternatives.
Okay.
Sure.
I make cheese, I make goat's cheese. Is that the same way?
Yes.
That's the same exact way.
Yes. Okay, so we mentioned the fact that a lot of meats are fermented, and we're not aware of it. Did you know that ham and bacon and salami and sausages, most of these are traditional fermented foods? It's what's called charcuterie. And this is something you only find today in America in high-priced, fine dining restaurants, but the really expensive chefs that have all the best training, they serve these meats as hors d'oeuvres or as part of a meal. And what's exciting is this is kind of coming back into use by local farms. For Christmas, I ordered a charcuterie assortment from a farmer down in Southern Virginia, and it was really fun to experiment with all these different meats. But basically, the fish sauce you get on a Mongolian barbecue, the fish sauce is a fermented product. And Weston Price members, we're big on fermented cod liver oil. You know, the fishermen in the olden days, in the old world, they would clean the fish and they'd throw the livers in the barrel on the front porch, and the livers would just sit there and basically, we would call it rot, but they would sit there and ferment, and that's where they went for their daily dose of cod liver oil, was to that barrel of livers on the front porch. So there's a modern American farmer that's mass producing it now and selling it like hotcakes to Weston Price members. And it's very high in vitamin A and D, which is why it's a coveted thing by people that are looking to heal. And by the way, for those of you unfamiliar with Weston Price, we consider ourselves a therapeutic diet. We've healed people from many, many different maladies by getting them on our program. And so many of our members are people that were very, very sick, and now they're getting themselves well and their whole families well. A lot of parents looking for answers for sick children find us. And so that's how we've grown over the years. It's just that we've actually been able to turn people's health around, and then they start raising their whole families on the diet, and they get all the other benefits just from getting a strong constitution to begin with, so you avoid illness. The latest craze in Italy is the fermented meat cure. There's a little inn outside of Parma, Italy, called the Inn Osteria da Ivan, and they do the meat cure. And what happens is the guests come to the inn, they sit around this table. See, it's hard to see, but there's a wooden table down the middle of that room. They're surrounded by cases of sparkling wines and champagnes, and up above is hanging the charcuterie. See the meats hanging from the rafters? So they're air cured, and they use salt, and they use the natural lactobacillus to preserve the meat. It just takes time. So what happens is the guests sit around the table. They've got an array of artisan cheeses and charcuterie in front of them. They start the meal with a napkin, linen napkin on their head. They lean over, they smell the aromas of the meat, and then they take the napkin, put it on their lap, and then they enjoy fine wine and a wonderful meat cure. This inn also has, they do prosciutto wraps for tennis knee, a tennis elbow and runner's knee. They do cured meat facials for skin softening, and they also have their masseuse give lard massages. And lard is pork fat, and it's very, very high in vitamin D. When the pigs are raised naturally in their natural environment, which is the woods and the fields, and they're getting lots of sunshine, they convert all that sunshine into vitamin D in their fat, and so that's why it's a therapeutic massage to use lard. So any of you masseuses in the room, keep that in mind. You can buy really good lard from Amish farmers. So this is my home-cured bacon. You know, when you start buying at the farmer's market, you get some weird experiences, one of which is you buy bacon that's not been cured. It's just basically strips of pork. It tastes terrible. It tastes like pork chop. And what we don't realize is that, you know, the curing process really does enhance the flavor, and it adds that salt and that sugar. So I called a cookbook author friend of mine. I said, how do I turn this blah bacon into something edible, you know, something my husband won't complain about? And so he sent me back this recipe. It's so simple. He said, puree an apple, take 3 cups of filtered water, take 3 cloves of garlic and mash them. Just mash them with the side of your chef's knife against the board. 2 tablespoons of sea salt. I now throw in herbs sometimes. I put in 2 sprigs of rosemary from my backyard herb garden, and then coarsely ground black pepper. And then you leave it, cover it with a lid or plastic wrap, leave it sit on the kitchen counter 12 hours to 24 hours. Then you put it in the refrigerator. When you're ready to make your bacon, you just take a couple layers of paper towels, you pat the bacon dry, put it in the frying pan and fry it, and it tastes really, really good. But I'll tell you what, I had a niece living with me. The first time I served her my homemade bacon, she decided she didn't want to live with us anymore. So it might be an acquired taste. She moved out the next day. I think she thought Aunt Kimberly was a little beyond the bend making her own bacon. So anyway, there's down in Raleigh, North Carolina, the University of North Carolina, there's a scientist, Fred Bright is his name. Back in that school, they have been studying ferments and pickling since the 1930s, and he says that lactoferments are even safer than a lot of the raw food that you would get at the grocery store because of the mass producing of raw produce these days. There's a lot of E. coli problems in the fields. And there's the biggest foodborne illness outbreaks we've had of late have been from produce. They've been from leafy greens, from spinach. They've even had listeria outbreak with cantaloupe. And what I've learned as a food blogger is that one of the things that's happening is that they're putting sewage sludge on American farm fields. They're recycling human waste and whatnot on farm fields, and if they're not treating it properly. The government's not requiring them to fully sterilize it. So if there's a farm field that gets treated that way, it can contaminate the produce. It can, and then it ends up in the food supply and people die. So anyway, Fred says that fermentation cultivates bacteriocins, which are actually proteins that are antibacterial. This is one thing that makes these fermented foods safe. It greatly extends the edible life of raw food because the metabolic byproducts inhibit pathogens and toxins. So this is another quote by Fred. He says, with fermented products, there's no safety concern. The reason is the lactic acid bacteria that carry out the fermentation are the world's best killers of other bacteria. And this is my little killer bacteria there. One of the things you should know is if you're starting to feel ill or if you think you're wanting to protect yourself against foodborne illness, always have ferments in your diet. Like if you have to rely on grocery store produce and you're doing a lot of raw food, always make sure you top your salad with a dollop of sauerkraut. Always make sure you're adding those probiotics, and that will be somewhat protective. Cultured raw dairy we consider a probiotic powerhouse. The reason why is dairy food is a total complete food. It has protein, it has fat, it has carbohydrates, it has enzymes. And the baby calf, the first immune system it gets from its mother is the milk. And it's very, very potent in its healing properties. There used to be sanatoriums all over America where they did the milk cure, and people that were wasting away from various and sundry diseases would go, and they would do nothing but bed rest, fresh air, and raw milk, fresh milk. And what happens is, basically a dairy farmer told me, milk is nothing more than white blood cells and water. You know, those killer T cells, it's full of that stuff. So it would probably be very good for AIDS patients and things like that. But they would go and they would do the milk cure, and there have been people actually lived for decades and decades on nothing but milk, people that have burnt their esophagus in an accident swallowing as a child a caustic substance. And they've literally been able to survive because milk is a whole complete package. It's got everything you need for survival. And I found out my great-grandmother was cured of TB by a raw milk and raw egg regime prescribed by her doctor in the 1930s. So in any event, there's a modern family that's republished a 100-year-old book called The Milk Diet. It was by a doctor, and they discovered that fermented milk is even more powerful. You don't need the bed rest. You can go about your daily life, and if you do copious amounts of fermented milk, such as kefir or yogurt, that it can be very healing. So, but we do stress that you must get your fresh milk from a grass-based farmer that's raising the animals naturally. They're not in a factory barn. They're out in the pastures getting fresh air, sunshine, exercise. Being able to engage in natural human behaviors, loving each other, loving the farmer. Usually the cows are named, and it's been proven that cows that are named give more and better milk. And the idea is they're getting their species-appropriate diet, they're not being abused in any way, and the animals are treated like part of the family. So we do have a website, realmilk.com, where you can find sources of fresh milk in your area. And also, I recommend you read our website, get more educated about it. Let's see. People have been fermenting dairy for millennia. There's actually evidence of this from every culture around the world. The Maasai warriors, which Dr. Weston A. Price studied in the 1930s, they drank a form of fermented milk from their animals because they would put it in these leather pouches hanging on their animals, and it fermented naturally. Like clabbered milk is when I take my fresh milk and I put it in my corner cupboard. I don't even add anything to it. And naturally, over a period of days, it turns into a yogurt-type substance. So this is what was happening in the pouch of the Maasai warrior. And then the Swiss Highlanders that Dr. Price studied, they raised their sheep and their goats and their cows in the highlands in the summertime. And when they would come down in the highlands for the winter, they would have to house the animals in barns. They preserved all that summer milk in the form of butter and cheese so that they could survive throughout the cold winters when the animals weren't producing milk. The origins of cheese are unclear, but much of it was found in the Baltics. The benefits of cultured dairy, we've gone into a few of these. Probiotics for gut health. It pre-digests the proteins in the milk. For people that have lactose intolerant, often it's the milk proteins they have trouble digesting. And so the pre-digestion of those proteins may make it so that your clients can have dairy again, which a lot of people are pretty excited about. It also pre-digests the sugars in the milk, so if you're trying to do a low glycemic approach to your diet, having a fermented milk is better for you if you're trying to do it for weight control or whatever. 10 minutes, okay. Obviously, it preserves the milk. The yogurt and the kefir last a lot longer. And we do have some cheese for you guys to taste. I make yogurt cheese when I'm making my whey. What's in the top of the little strainer, that's the yogurt cheese. So if anybody would like to taste it, it's basically cream cheese. And this is made with my raw milk that I get from my cow share here in Virginia. And one of the things I suggest people do with it is make it into sort of a boursin-like thing on a cheese platter. Put a lot of cracked pepper, maybe a little garlic on it, and serve it with some hard cheeses on a platter at a party. The other thing I do with it is, well, you can make a cheesecake, but I add lemon juice and honey and add a little bit of the whey back in and make it soupy, and then I use it as a fruit dip. It's wonderful that way. Anyway, so there's many culinary uses of cultured dairy. Baking, it's good for baking, and here's some examples. You can do a kefir or yogurt smoothie. You can take kefir or yogurt and make a ranch-style dressing by adding herbs and garlic and salt and pepper. Did you have a question? Or he just wants a sample. Okay. And there's a cheesecake there. So we have a few stories to tell you about healing with ferments. Does anybody know who this girl dates? When I first started telling her story, she wasn't dating him. It's now kind of embarrassing, but Lindsey Vonn is now dating Tiger Woods, but she was a competitor in the Vancouver Winter Olympics a couple of seasons ago, and she injured herself on a training run. She got a very bad shin injury, very painful, And apparently, the Austrian ski team taught her an Austrian folk remedy, which was to rub her shin with castor oil and then wrap it in Topfen, which is an unaged fresh cheese that's made in Austria. So I've actually used my yogurt cheese when it starts to get moldy and stuff on my knees. When my knees were having like a little bit of pain or burning sensation, I would put that cold cheese on my knees while I watched TV. It felt so good. And I feel like, well, from her story, I was inspired because she went on to win the Olympic gold medal in women's downhill skiing. I mean, it could have been an injury that benched her, where she couldn't have competed in the race, and she went on to win a gold medal. So that's the power of fermented cheese right there. And Dawn's going to tell you Red's story.
Yeah, Red is my very first client, and he was, about 2 years ago, he was probably about 20 to 25 pounds overweight. He was pretty much eating the standard American diet. He was diagnosed with H. pylori, which is a digestive disorder that many Americans have, and he pretty much lived on Tums. So we started him on a regimen of fermented foods, the fermented foods that we talked about, and a lot of you have talked to me already about the fermented foods at my table. We also put him on green juices, and he probably tripled his water intake. And within 6 to 8 months, there he is. He ran his first half marathon. So that's Red's story.
Is anybody familiar with the term crowdsourcing? Do you know what that is? I happen to have learned about it because I manage the Facebook page for the Weston A. Price Foundation. I highly commend it to you. It's a very active page. There's lots of good conversations go on there. But I crowdsourced a story for you that is just unbelievable. I cannot wait for you to hear this story. A woman wrote me, oh no, it's the next story. Well, let me tell you my brother's story first. This is, the crowdsourcing story comes last. I forgot. This is my younger brother's story. My younger brother was diagnosed with celiac when he was a child. And at the time, my mother was going to a German doctor at a very prestigious clinic here in Washington, D.C. at the time called the Yater Clinic. I mean, we lived in the suburbs, but she hauled us downtown to see Dr. Knopp. Anyway, my mother's doctor didn't prescribe drugs for celiac. I can't even believe they knew what celiac was, but celiac is gluten intolerance for those of you that don't know. But he was given a regimen of nothing but cottage cheese. He could only eat cottage cheese. He stayed on that for 2 years, morning, noon, and night. And do you know he continued to enjoy cottage cheese the rest of his life? He's enjoyed cottage cheese. He ended up being 6'4", rugby player in college, very, very beautiful facial features. So he got through that childhood disease with a fermented food. But here's Larissa's story, the story that I introduced at the wrong point. She is a 44-year-old female. She went undiagnosed with celiac for 42 years, which eventually led to Crohn's disease, hypothyroid, vision loss, symptoms of MS, Parkinson's, and lupus. She suffered vertigo, skin rashes, slurred speech, brain fog, constant ear infections from birth, leading to hearing loss. What happened was she went to the hospital. She met with a gastroenterologist who got a nutritionist involved, a dietitian. They made her worse. And, she's pretty much at the end of the rope. Larissa actually lost her house. She lost all her personal belongings. She couldn't even send me a picture to illustrate the slide because she goes to the library to do the internet. I can't even believe she happened to see my query on Facebook. She must have been at the library at that moment. It must have been meant to be, right? But she went to the library, and she found Sally Fallon's cookbook in the stacks, looking for answers for herself. She goes, Kim, I love the book so much, I literally slept with it in my arms. And today, she makes all kinds of fermented foods. She makes sauerkraut, sourdough bread. She does milk kefir. She does water kefir, which is another thing that some people that don't like dairy might want to try. It makes like a soda type of drink. And she said everything but the vision loss and the hearing loss have gone away. I mean, have gradually started going away. So she's very, very grateful. And then when she saw the story of my brother on her blog, she wrote me back. She goes, how do you make cottage cheese? I'm like, I don't know. We had a farmer selling it to us at the time, so I don't know how to make it. You'll have to go. But Ferments are condiments. With the exception of fermented dairy, which is something you can make a whole meal out of, we recommend ferments because they're so probiotic and powerful that you implement them as condiments in your diet, not as a mainstay. You don't want to go hog wild and have nothing but ferments for lunch. You want to have a dollop of it. My husband and I do like a 2-ounce portion. Or now he's doing ferments with his sausages. He'll do like 4 or 5 ounces of sauerkraut. But you want to consume them in small amounts throughout the day. If you start to have a reaction like diarrhea, it just means you might have a lot of bad gut bacteria, and the good probiotics are going to war with the bad, which is a good thing. But if it's unpleasant, you just back off the probiotics a little bit. You back off the ferments, and then you try again. These are the resources I wanted to tell you about. Of course, Nourishing Traditions Cookbook is like the Bible for all of this. And I mentioned the Weston Price website, the realmilk.com website. The Weston Price website is really powerful because it has all the archives of our magazine, Wise Traditions. And you can put any health condition in our search box, and you will get articles by doctors and scientists, all kinds of really good research material, heavily footnoted with science for your use as a clinical practitioner. NourishedKitchen.com is a very popular Weston Price food blog. She has an online ferment class called How to Ferment Anything. So I recommend that. CaldwellBiofermentation.com is a company in Canada that does sell some ferments, but they also sell a culture that if you're dairy sensitive, it comes from dairy whey, but the final product of your ferment will be only 1 part per million of dairy, and for people that are not like severely dairy allergic, they can consume it with no issues. Cultures for Health is a wonderful fermentation website. They actually exhibit at our international conference. And then cheesemaking.com, which I consider pretty advanced fermenting. I wouldn't start there, but if you're a farmer and you're ready to go there, cheesemaking.com is where you buy cheese making supplies and instructions and this type of thing. And I believe Cultures for Health would have free fermenting videos for you. And so does our website. Our YouTube channel, the Weston Price YouTube channel, probably has several videos on fermenting. And then, of course, my blog, hartkeisonline.com. I'd love for you to fan me on Facebook or subscribe to my blog. And Dawn, if you'd like to give a little pitch for your business, we're done.
Right. Well, first I want to say the whey is forming now. I don't know if you can see it. I only use about a half a cup of yogurt, and so we have about maybe 2 tablespoons of whey. So that is all done. What I in the essence of time, I was going to show you how to make ginger carrots. The recipe is in the back, but I used my food processor, and I grated the carrots and the ginger. The portions are on the recipe sheet, and carrots are a lot more juicy than sauerkraut, so I pound it for about 5 minutes, and the juices just come right out. And then again, I put it in a mason jar, press it down like I showed you earlier, and Elise is going to give whoever wants some samples. You can raise your hand. We only have about 10, and you can also, again, purchase that at my table. And I am based in Herndon, Virginia, and would love to speak to anyone who's interested.
What's your business name?
Sunrise Nutritional Therapy.
Any other questions? Do we have time for questions?
Yes, but please use the microphone to the right if you have questions.
Right here. Dara,
Do you have a question?
you want to
Please
come up to the mic? Oh.
So on one of the slides, it said that it pre-digests the proteins in dairy. What about casein?
Well, casein is a dairy protein, so I'm imagining that that's one of the proteins that pre-digests. You know, that's the one dairy allergy that, you know, for some people, it's resistant to all dairy. You just have to test it and see if it works for you. But I really don't actually know the scientific answer to your question, but I'm assuming that.
Hi, good evening. I'm Red, so I had to honor my wife by coming up here. One of the things Dawn didn't get a chance to mention is the amount of statins my doctors were trying to put me on to deal with these problems. So if you have patients or are yourselves going through these situations, I was being handed all sorts of Lipitor and all these different things, and I kept ripping up the prescriptions, telling them I'm not going to take them. And it was by the blessings of my wife who introduced me to all these fermented foods and natural foods that over time, when I went back to my doctors, they simply said, well, I don't know, keep doing, you're running, yeah, keep running, is what they told me. So I just wanted to thank Dawn and all of you who are nutritional therapists. There's so much work to be done and so much healing you can perform. There are a lot of people who need your help. So if you're just starting out, I mean, my wife is just getting started. I encourage you to build your practices and find people who need help, because there are a lot of us out there looking for you guys. So I just want to encourage you guys. So.
I have a question about long-term storage of fermented foods. How was it done back in the day? They would only have their crops come up, what, in August. How would they keep their ferments?
Well, everybody had a basement. I don't, what is that called? It's a cellar.
Cellar.
Like a root cellar, that's what it's called. And people would keep things very cold down there, you know, right close to the ground. And so that's how they did it. And obviously the original ice boxes were very, very small. So every house had a root cellar. They just don't make houses anymore like that, you know. So if you're deciding to move to the country, look for a house with a deep cellar, you know.
They used to build food cellars right into the ground. There are actually houses in Baltimore that were built in the like 20s or whatever, and they have food cellars outside. You go outside and it's like a cave into the ground with a door.
Interesting.
And storage shelves where they would put the things.
Yeah, you could build your own. If your house is a slab rambler, just build one next. Well, sauerkraut keeps 8 months. I mean, that's almost all winter. And so, you know, they may not have it in the early spring or late spring, but then they've got other things to eat then, because things are starting to grow up out of the ground.
We have time for one more question.
Any more questions? Any comments? Does somebody have a healing story related to ferments, or somebody new at fermenting that's having fun doing it you want to share? How many people are inspired to try ferments after today? Awesome! Yay! Yay, well, have fun. It's really a fun hobby, and it's easy to do. And I do recommend the Container Store for nice jars to do it in. They've got these wonderful French, you know, jars that are wonderful. So come up and see us at our booth after. Oh, come up to the mic, please.
Quick question.
Oh. Well, there's a number of farms that offer cow shares. It is an investment. You do need to buy a share of a cow. And then in my case, my farmer delivers it right to my garage refrigerator every week. It is a long-term commitment. Right now in Virginia, the only legal way to obtain raw milk is through a cow share. We're hoping that changes, because like other states like Pennsylvania, you can go to a health food store and buy it, or you can, you know, the farmer can deliver it right to you, but, and you can buy it by the bottle. But we recommend to go to realmilk.com and look for realmilk.com, yes. You always use whey. Okay. If you can't hear, she's from Russia, and she said America's really lacking in this area of cultured dairy. We just don't have any history of culturing dairy left in America. But she's going to maybe share the recipe on my blog that she has for her cultured dairy projects. So that would be great. I'll give you my card. Thank you very much for coming.